criticism. So the basic idea of inductivism, we have to start with something, with an observation which is rather simple, but I have to make it explicit here because otherwise we don't understand the procedure of inductivism and the main idea of inductivism. It's the observation that in science and engineering we find singular statements and general statements, right? Singular statements, general, never heard that possibly. I'm going to explain to you. What are singular statements? Singular statements, for instance, now I try to use examples from your area, right? I told you already, my original training is in physics, so I'm not a water engineer. I have no idea, well, I read a little, but I don't know very much about it. I know a little more about horticulture science because I heard so many presentations by the horticulture students during the last 10 years, so I learned a little about it. So if my examples are really stupid, then please tell me. If the water people tell me, look, this is nonsense. Well, I looked it up in the internet. There are lakes that are contaminated by pesticides and heavy metals, right? Am I not right? There are lakes. They are heavily contaminated. So now imagine you stand in front of such a lake, and then a water engineer says, this lake is contaminated by pesticides and heavy metals. That's a singular statement. A singular statement because you speak about a singular object in front of you, right? That lake, and you say something about that lake, okay? Now the horticulture people will say, I don't understand this example, right? Because I'm not a water engineer. Am I not right? Not really? Okay, I have now this is the example for the horticulture students, right? This plant has 9 leaves. Yeah, you imagine you have the plant in front of you, you count the leaves, and then you say, this plant has 9 leaves. I know it's sometimes important to count the leaves, right? Not for all of you, those who do economics of horticulture, of course, don't care about leaves at all. They see money, right? For instance, export, import, gross national product, whatever. Okay, but you can't, I think everyone can understand this one. This plant has 9 leaves. That's a singular statement. Why? Not because the number 9 is here, because you talk about that plant in front of you, right? About this singular little thing, that plant, or big thing, maybe a big, well, if big things have usually more than 9 leaves, but imagine winter time, right? Then the big oak may have 9 leaves. We'll come to that state. I'll give you examples then when you look out, okay? Here are examples both for the engineers and for the horticulture students. All right, back here, please. Concentrate here on that. This plant has 9 leaves. That's a singular statement. Now, true singular statements express singular facts. If a singular statement is true, then it expresses something, and expresses a singular fact. Namely, for instance, this one expresses the fact that the lake is contaminated by pesticides and heavy metals, right? And the other one expresses the fact that the plant has 9 leaves. That's very simple, but it's important to be aware that you say, okay, what's a singular statement? Oh, if a singular statement is true, then it expresses a singular fact, right? A fact like this plant has 9 leaves. Okay. Sounds very trivial. Now, in science and engineering, the singular statements that you find there often, not always, but often express observable and or measurable facts. So if you do an analysis of a certain lake, for instance, and you are asked as a water engineer, you say, look, this lake, it's very funny that the fish are all dead in this lake. Isn't that an accident, or what happened? And then you say, well, very simple. We just look at the contamination of that lake, right? And you measure the pesticides, and you measure the heavy metals in there, and you find 50% is not water but heavy metals, for instance, which is a very high concentration. I know, and I'm exaggerating a little. Okay. Then you say, okay, I have established the fact that this lake is contaminated by heavy metals. And you can express that singular fact, and you establish that fact by measuring them or by observing them. So for the horticulture scientists, you establish that fact, that 9 leaves, that you observe it and you count it, and you say, yes, here, that's the fact, right? So many of these singular statements that you find in these areas, both in science and in engineering, they are singular statements that express observable facts. Not all facts are observable, right? If you go to cosmology, right, that's not a field that you study here. In cosmology, where you study the history of the cosmos, then today's cosmologists, they state the fact there was a big bang in the beginning of everything, right? That's a fact about that's a singular statement about a singular fact. Well, if it is a fact, I mean, people believe it, okay? And that's, of course, not observable. You cannot ask a cosmologist, oh, let's go out and let's observe the Big Bang, right? That's not possible. Why not? Well, it was in the past, for instance. And if you could observe it, you wouldn't survive it, right? And you didn't, well, it's quite clear. Does everyone know what the Big Bang is? It's a rather big bang, right? It's very loud. Is it loud? No, it's not loud because you have no air, right? Okay. All right. In science and engineering, often expressed, therefore I say often here, observable facts, and that will be the starting point of the position. I'm not telling you because I want to impress you what I know about singular facts, because that's the basic then of inductivism, because that'll be the starting point of inductivism, namely the singular statements that express observable facts. That is where I move to. Okay, and therefore I have here this distinction between the singular statements and the general statements. So that is the case, and we will see that that will be the starting point of that position that I'm going to develop that is called inductivism. And you still don't know why this is called inductivism, which is fine. All right? So these are the singular facts. Now, in this case, if a singular statement expresses an observable fact, then it's easy to verify the statement. To verify means to find out the truth of the statement, right? It's very easy because what you do, you observe or measure and you will know, right? So if someone tells you, look, this lake is very contaminated, or if someone says the river Leine is very contaminated by this and that, by pesticides, you say, well, I don't know, perhaps he's right, perhaps he's wrong. And if someone says, well, please establish the fact whether the Leine is contaminated by pesticides and heavy metals, you say, very easy. You know, you pull out your measuring instruments, go to the Leine and measure it, and then you establish it. Said, well, the concentration of this and that and that is so high and high. Yes, that counts as contaminated, therefore the Leine is contaminated. So it's no big deal, really, to find out whether a singular statement is true or not, in many cases, if it is a singular statement about observable facts or measurable facts. But what you do is very simple. You go there and observe it, or you go there and measure it, and then you know, right? So if someone claims this tree here has, well, you don't see that if I point out there. This tree here has 1,400 leaves, right? In principle, you simply go out, spend your lunch there, don't eat, don't drink, and count the leaves, right? And then you say, no, it's not 1,400, it's something else, 1,200 or whatever. Right? But in principle, you know exactly what to do if you want to find out whether a certain observable statement is true or not. You simply go there and you measure and observe. And that's very simple with singular facts. It's very simple because in singular facts you have one object you have to look at, right? One, the lake in front of you, or the river Leine, or that particular tree, or a particular plant. You look at it and observe it and measure it, and then you know, right? And that's comparatively simple, right? But science isn't that simple because it does not only contain singular statements, it also contains something else, namely different general statements in the sciences. And the question why I made this distinction here between singular statements and general statements is that the procedure to find out whether statements are true, these procedures are different for singular statements and for general statements. Right? And as we are interested in science, whether it's true and whether it's good knowledge and so on and so forth, we are interested in how do the sciences find out whether something is true or not. And because the procedures are different for singular statements and general statements, I made the difference between these sorts of statements. Right? And the point is that the problem with finding out whether a scientific statement is true or not, or an engineering science statement is true or not, the problem does not really arise with the singular statements because they are fairly often quite unproblematic. You simply measure or simply observe, right, the singular case. But the problem is when you come to the general statements, right? And the general statements present problems, and these problems then provoke this position, which is called inductivism. And therefore I make this distinction, just that you know what I'm doing here and why I'm doing it. Okay? So, in earlier classes, people asked me I should say more about these terms that are going to come now, the terms like hypothesis, theory, model, and so on, because you use these terms, but you don't really know what they mean very often. At least people told me, students told me. Therefore, I did that for the first time. This is now a premiere, right? You are the first one who sees that. Nobody else has seen that before. Isn't that wonderful? Well, let's see whether it's good. Then we'll find out. There are different kinds of general statements in the sciences, and I want to talk about this difference of the general statements. Now, let's see whether, yes. There are things like natural laws. All of you heard of natural laws, of course, because you have studied natural science and engineering. Natural laws like Newton's law of gravitation. That's a general statement. It tells you something about all cases of gravitation, right? That's the idea of a natural law. It tells you something very solid. And if you want to remember, that means the force is gamma, that's the gravitational constant, then mass 1 times mass 2 divided by the square of the distance. It tells you that's Newton's law of gravitation, as you have all in the slides, right? If you copy that, you copy it, it's on the slide, it's in the printout, okay? Have you seen it? Have you got the printout? Right, it's there, yeah? Oh, I'm sorry, is that already, that's the number 7, okay. Yes, you can download it, okay? I'm sorry, I didn't realize we are already at number 7. I only gave you 6, you know, in order to force you to go to StudIP. No, you can download it there, right? Okay. So, but yeah, so you may take notes now, but I promise it's there. We checked it just before. It's there on StudIP. You can download it unless the mainframe breaks down. Okay. Now, okay. So this is Newton's law. Who has never heard of Newton's law of gravitation? Very good. You are too shy to show me who haven't heard. Anyway, now the point is with natural laws, when in science something is called a natural law, like Newton's law of gravitation, it's, first of all, of course, it's a general statement. You don't say anything about something very specific. You don't talk about the Earth or the Sun, or for instance, this little instrument has also gravitation, and it gravitationally interacts with the Earth. If I let loose now, then we'll see the gravitational interaction very clearly. They are supposed to be certain. When scientists, natural scientists, speak about laws, natural laws, they think they really know the laws, and the law is certain, and it's usually, or very often, there are exceptionalist laws, and you simply know that they are true, right? They are supposed to be certain. Natural laws are general statements that are certain, okay? Then we have something else. Natural scientists don't only speak about natural laws, they also speak about theories. In other words, theory means different things in different contexts. It's not that it's always the same thing, what you mean when you say theory. And what does that mean? Well, it may mean very well established, very general statements, like, say, Darwin's theory of evolution or quantum theory. I mean, here you even see theory, Darwin's theory of evolution, right? So this is something extremely general. Darwin's theory of evolution is supposed to apply to everything living on Earth, right? Just everything. Everything was evolved according to mutation and selection, to put it in a very short form, Darwin's theory of evolution, or quantum theory, if you look at things that are rather small, with low energy, then with little energies, say atoms, or molecules, or something, then quantum theory applies. And the idea is that quantum theory applies really absolutely exceptionlessly, right? All the cases of molecules, atoms or so, obey the laws of quantum theory, right? That's the idea. The same with Darwin theories. So we speak about theories in the natural sciences, very well established and very general statements, right? Very general meaning here in Darwin's theory of evolution. Just every organism is supposed to have evolved according to Darwin's theory. Or in quantum theory, just every sort of atom, every sort of nucleus, every sort of molecule obeys the laws of quantum mechanics. That's the idea of theory, and very well established. So if you today say a biologist, and you say, well, I don't think that Darwin's theory is right, I think that's nonsense. I mean, better go home, right? I mean, all the other biologists will say, sorry, wrong class. Okay? It's so well established, the same if you are a physicist and say, no, quantum theory is false. I mean, it's very simple. Then people will say, you're crazy, right? You don't understand what you're talking about. So these are very well established, and you have, of course, this is one sort of meaning, or one way how to use the term theory for these very well established, very general statements, like Darwin's theory of evolution. There are other theories, of course, but these are just two examples. That's one way of using the word theory. But there is another use of theory, and that means really something different, but we also call it theory, and that's general statements about which you are unsure. So it's just the opposite. Here you are unsure, and here it's very well established. When you say it's just a theory, right? If someone says, you know, blah, blah, and then someone answers, well, you know, this is just a theory, meaning, well, you can't be too sure about it. You know, this is what you think. And that's also what is called a hypothesis. You know, when people say that's a hypothesis, then, you know, you are unsure. You play around with it and you say, yes, it's a hypothesis. I look at it, I consider it, I may analyze it, I may do some research on the basis of that hypothesis. But by saying it's a hypothesis, I'm expressing that I'm not sure of it. It's not certain that it is true, right? And that is also a use of theory. It's just a theory or hypothesis. By this term, you express your possible doubt about it. You're not saying it's false, but you say, look, I don't really know whether it's true or not. And that is why we use in science then the term hypothesis, because we very often deal with general statements about something, and we are not yet sure whether it's right. So I guess, I mean, isn't it in horticulture science, you have to formulate, when you do your outline of your research project, you have to hypothesis, you know, and that's the idea, the hypothesis is, and then you go to the next section is then, what is it, testing or methodological procedure, methods or what? How to test the hypothesis, right? And if you admit that you have to test the hypothesis, of course you admit that you are not completely sure that's true, but the point is that you say, well, that's interesting, right? If for instance, sunlight now influences the growth of these plants in such and such a way, say, yeah, that's my hypothesis, let's test it, right? And then you play around with the sun and play, well, that's a little difficult, but you may play around with artificial light, right? And then look what the impact of the light is, and so on and so forth. So that's an hypothesis, something you play around with. You may show that it's true, or you may even show, you may want to show in other contexts that it's false. But the point is that you are not sure about it, right? That's the idea of hypothesis. And sometimes you use the term theory in the same way, but be careful. It's really very different when you use it. It's just a theory. You don't mean something as solid as quantum mechanics, right? Certainly not. But you want to say, look, I'm not really sure whether it's true, and I want to consider it, I want to test it, or I want to confirm it, or justify it, or whatever. All right. So this is the term theories. But there are here, for instance, this is a wonderful example for the horticulture people. My theory or my hypothesis is that plants of species X are not seriously affected by a change in their environmental condition. Why? Right? That is something where the horticulture students find themselves. Say, yes, that sounds familiar. Yes, wonderful. Not for the economists, right, among you. Perhaps I have an example later for the economists as well, all right? There are so many different people here, so I can't do everything for everyone at the same time. Right, so you have my theory is that, and that means then, yes, you know something about these plants of species X, and you say, well, I guess this is the case. They are not seriously affected by a change in environmental condition Y. And then your supervisor tells you, so devise an experiment. Tell me what the methods are to test this hypothesis. And then you say, okay, I put 400 plants there. And then I systematically change environmental condition Y. And then I look, and then I count the plants. What is the effect, and blah, blah, blah. All right? So this is the dealing with hypotheses, because you don't know whether they are true, and what you want to do is you want to established, well, their truth or falsity is a little high, but at least you want to have arguments to defend the hypothesis, or you want to have arguments to attack the hypothesis, right? You want to deal with it, whether it's more true or less true or not true, or something like that. You want to evaluate it according to its, one could say, truth content, whatever that is. Okay, so this is theories and hypotheses. These are terms that are used in science, and we are now a little clearer about what they may mean. I continue 5 more minutes, and then we have a short break. Okay? And then we have something which you may hear probably in engineering as well, and in the sciences, that one speaks about regularities or empirical regularities. You also find that, of course, in the social sciences. Are any social scientists here as well? People with a social science training? Okay, so you learn something about the social sciences as well. Oh, we have a social scientist in the back, but that doesn't count today. All right, empirical regularities. And these are, in principle, these are general regular relations. It's a general, well, here it's a plural and here's a singular, I'm sorry. A general regular relation between different variables, right? You have a connection between variables, and that's regular. So if you change variable A a little, and then variable B changes in a certain way, and the connection between the two is expressed by the regularity, right? Is that a way engineers speak as well about regularities? Engineers sometimes? Well, if you have a table and you have, say, variables on one side and the dependent variables on the other side, you call that a table probably, just a table, function or whatever. Function. Okay. Empirical regularities. That's a term that's also used in the sciences in different branches. And finally, there is something which is called a model. That a model is also a general thing. It applies to many different cases usually. And a model is also such a general statement. And here it is typically a simplified image of a general relation among different variables. Right? So, I come to an example later. For instance, one speaks about model organisms. Any idea? Can someone give me an example of a model organism in biology? Right, it's a plant, right? And there are, of course, animals as well, where you have that's the specific plant, this model, or you have other models. These are, I mean, they are simpler than other plants. That's the belief, at least. So if you want to experiment on plants and you have complicated plants, then you say, okay, let's first experiment with these model organisms because they exhibit then in a simpler way what we want to understand, right? And that is model organisms. The idea is, this is of course not an image of a general relation, but a sort of image. It's in model organisms that you can investigate something, and you hope then that in the model organism it's simpler than in other cases, but you have a hope, of course, that you can transfer that something you learn about the model organism can be transferred to other organisms. That's a hope that's sometimes justified, sometimes not. That's not my point. My point is here simply that you become aware what the term model means. It's another thing is when you speak of a model of an economy is a very, very, very complicated. Are economists here as well? Hopefully from the horticulture science? Yes, good. Economists. So when you speak a model of an economy, you say, okay, I mean, there may be 1 million households and 10,000 firms and 15,000 governmental agencies that all interact, and it's a mess and complicated, and you can't say anything about it. So you say, let's make a simplified model, right? We make a model of a 1 million households, and they have all the same preferences, for instance. And we model the governmental agencies. We model they have laws and they restrict the actions of the households and so on and so forth. You simplify, right? You make a simplified image of the general relations. Or if you take the model of a lake, for instance, if you have a certain lake, and this is now for the water people, if you have a lake, I mean, the lake is very complicated, it has a very complicated topography, and you want to understand what happens with the lake, and you have outflows and inflows and evaporation, and you have minerals, and you have whatnot and damages and so on and so forth. And you can't. If you look at that lake, you can't really have all the details. So what you say, let's make a model of the lake. Let's assume the model is just round. right? It's not, of course, in reality it's not round. Let's make it round, and it's got constant depth, right? 15 meters, period. And then I've got the volume of the water that I want to investigate. And we assume it's just water in, and we have one inflow, one outflow, and evaporation rate such and such. You simplify, and what you do really is you have general relations, and then you say, yes, the general relations are then with the inflow and the outflow in this model is such and such. And then you model the lake, and you have general, that is the very important point here, general relations. So, as I said, we have in the sciences and in engineering, we have very different sorts of things which are general statements. The general statements may express theories, they may express empirical regularities, they may express models. Yes. Now the important point is why I made the difference, I told you earlier, between the singular statements and the general statements is this, that the general statements, that means laws, theories, general hypotheses, regularities, and models, they cannot be verified in the same way as singular statements. And why not? Because they refer to indefinitely many facts. It's not just one fact, but very many. I give you an example, okay? Now, okay, I first tell you that this is problematic. The so-called generalization of singular statements to general statements is problematic. You are not taking about a singular case where you can make a decision what is the case by looking at it and measuring it, because you talk about many, many cases. And just look at the following case. That's a standard example. For example, consider the generalization from the observation of some finite number of swans that are white. If you observe this, so you go to the, I don't know where the swans are in Hannover, in the zoo, for instance, or perhaps on the Leine, and you go there and you observe the swans, and all the swans are white, and then you say, well, I've seen now 15 of them, all swans are white. Okay? Is that a good generalization that all swans are white? No? Who comes from Australia? Nobody, but you've read it. There are black swans, right? It happens to be the case. There are just black swans. So the generalization from your observations that you do here in Europe, unless you go to the zoo where they have black swans, but if you just go to the rivers and to the lakes, say in Germany, and watch the swans, and then you say, yes, I've seen them, you know, and now I give you a general hypothesis about swans, namely all swans are white. This is tricky because you haven't seen all swans, but you talk about all swans, right? And that's the problem with the general statements, because you talk about all sorts of things with the general statements, but you haven't seen all of them, right? And that's the problem, right? But what happens is in science that we want to have the general statements. I tell you after the break why we want to have the general statements. We need them, right? It's not enough in science just to say, okay, that's too dangerous. Let's forget about general statements. Only talk about this plant and that plant. I give it names. This is Anna, this is Franz, and this is Jim. That's not enough, right? Your supervisor would be very unhappy with you if you say, no, I refuse to talk about general things. I only talk about this particular plant. Say, no, sorry. In science, we have to have general knowledge about plants, about a certain species, for instance, because we want to not export this particular little plant that is dead in 3 years from now, but we want to have this species of plant and want to look what it does in that environment, you know, all sorts of them, all singular specimens of that species. So we are interested in general knowledge. I'll tell you more about that later. So we have to have general statements, but we have a problem with the general statements. You know, it's difficult to find out whether they are good statements, whether they are right, whether they are true, right? Because there are so many cases. And you see here, when you simply say, well, look at a number of swans and you find out their color. Yes, but you can make a mistake here, a grave mistake, that you say all swans are white, and it's just not true, because there are black swans. You unfortunately haven't seen any one of them. Let's continue here. The problem, as I said, is the problematic character of a generalization from singular statements to general statements. We are interested in general statements, but the question is, how can we find out how solid they are, whether we should believe them or whether we should not believe them? As I said, for a singular statement about a fact, empirical fact, observable fact, that's not a problem, but it is a problem about general statements. But as I show you a little later, we want to have in science, we must have in fact, in science general statements. We can't just say, well, they're too complicated, let's forget about them. We need them, so we have a problem here. Now let's see. The problem to how to correctly generalize from singular statements, and the justification of this step is called the problem of induction. That is where the term comes from. So you may have heard the term induction from in your physics classes, right? Electrical induction. That's something different, right? If you have a mathematics background, you may have a complete induction, but that's a different meaning of induction, right? The induction here means the generalization, it's called the inductive generalization, from the singular statements to the general statements, and the justification of that step, you need a justification because you can make mistakes there, right? As I said, with the white swans, if you observe 15 white swans and then you say, okay, probably they're all white, right? And then you see another one, a 16 one, say, yes, it's also white. Okay, all swans are white. That's dangerous, right? And you need some sort of justification. You need a backup why you are right in moving from singular statements to the general statements. And the problem is that's the problem of induction. And you'll see then the word induction now turns up for the first time, that inductivism has something to do with that sort of induction here, okay? Now, in dealing with this problem, now the position tells us something. Namely, it states that scientific knowledge about these general relations, general statements, I'm going to justify why we need them a little later, that we have to make two steps, two separate steps. And when we take very carefully these two steps, then we are justified in doing a inductive generalization, namely the step from singular statements to general statements. All right? And the two steps, I describe you now, the two steps. The first step is this one, and that may sound familiar, I guess, from the training you may have had in the natural sciences, because many scientists believe in that procedure, and it's very plausible to believe in this procedure, namely that in science you have to start with careful observation of the facts, right? You carefully observe singular facts without any theoretical prejudice, right? You simply observe what is the case. With no theoretical prejudice, forget about all your theories and hypotheses, and the motto is just observe what is the case, right? Observe the facts. Observe carefully the singular facts without any prejudice and articulate them in singular observation sentence. You have to write that down, right? Therefore you have in the lab, you have a book, right, in which you have to write down your observations because you have to record them in order that you can later discuss them, remember them, and discuss them. So inductivism, that's our position we are developing here, states then that in the first step that you observe carefully the singular facts, so you want to know something about a certain species of plants, for instance, and it says, yes, then observe the singular plants, right? Observe them carefully. Don't get seduced by your theoretical ideas that you have them. Forget them. Just observe what is the case, right? That you have to do. Observe them and write them down in singular observation sentences. Then you can say, the species, you have 400 plants then, and then you say here in box 1 we have 10 plants, and then plant 1, and plant 1, 2, and plant 1, 3, and you write down, say, the number of leaves or whatever it is you want to observe, right? And that's the first step, carefully observe that, and that's, of course, extremely plausible. You've got to get the facts right first, right? That's extremely plausible that in science you have to do that, and you have to write them down. Now, these singular observation statements can deliver an objective and also, therefore, intersubjective, meaning that everyone can agree, right? Intersubjective means everyone can agree, description of the facts, right? If you have then your 400 plants and say you're interested for some reason in growth, and you operationalize growth in number of leaves, for instance, then you say, okay, if you want to see how growth happens here, then you count the number of leaves, and you have your 400 plants, whatever your sample is, that's statistically solid enough, and then you describe what every singular plant, with the properties of every singular plant, and then you get an objective description of the facts as a basis for further things that you do in science, right? That's extremely plausible. It's also in every detective story, right? It's the same. First, let's get the facts, right? And then we reason who the murderer is, right? It's usually the gardener, not the engineer, right? Okay. All right. Now, these singular observation statements then can deliver these objective facts. That's the idea in the first step. Now comes step 2. And step 2 is generalize these singular observation statements to general hypotheses. You are interested in general hypotheses, say, about the influence of certain variables on a certain species, and then you look at individual specimens of these species, you make the experiment, and then you observe what's going to happen, and then what you have to do is then to generalize the singular observation statements to a general hypothesis. That's a hypothesis then not about the specific plants you looked at, the specimens, but to all those specimens of that species, right? You are interested in the behavior of the plants of a certain species, so you're not only interested in those specific plants you looked at, but for all those possible specimens of that species. So you want to articulate a general statement, and you want to have a law or a theory or model, whatever it is, then it just depends on your research situations. And then you generalize these singular observations, but you have to be careful in this generalization. There are certain rules. The inductive generalization is allowed if the following 3 conditions are met. So here are the restrictions. The position inductivism says, look, the generalization from singular facts to a general hypothesis is dangerous. You can make mistakes. In order to avoid mistakes, you have to follow, you must meet 3 conditions. And I'll tell you the conditions, and the conditions is immediately very plausible. If you want to know, say, something about all swans, don't just look at 1 or 2. You have to have more. Right? Every one of you who does some work here in horticulture, say working really with plants, has to have an idea how many plants how big your sample is. Yes, 400 is a number that sometimes that's quite reasonable, right? In some of the earlier classes, people used 400 plants, right? And then you perhaps have 2 groups or whatnot. Anyway. The number of observations must be large. It's not good enough to have 1 plant or 2 plants and then generalize from them, because they may be just untypical examples, and you have to somehow deal with that possibility of untypical examples. And then, of course, every plant is an individual. Every specimen is different from the other one, even if they are clones. So they are all different. So you must have a large number of observations. That's quite plausible. Otherwise, I mean, it's very difficult to generalize. It's impossible. So this is condition 1. The C here comes from condition, right? That's the same C. Well, that's a big one, that's a small one, but it is still a C, right? Okay. The number of observations must be large. The second condition under which you are allowed to make inductive generalization is the observations must be made under very different conditions, right? You must know that what you are observing is then stable. It must be right, it must be the same effect under different conditions. So therefore, in order to be allowed to make the inductive generalization, you have to vary the conditions. Otherwise, you run into the problem that you observe something which depends on a particular condition and is not a property of what you're looking at, say of the plant, but it's a property of the condition, of a specific condition. Therefore, you must use very different conditions. And the third condition that you must fulfill in order to be allowed to make the inductive generalization is, of course, that none of the observation statements must contradict the general hypothesis. Right? If your general hypothesis is that all swans are white, and you have observed 15 green ones and 2 gray ones, then of course you're not allowed to generalize all swans are white. So it must be the case that all the singular observations you make are then in agreement with the general statement, right? Otherwise, of course, you can't generalize. That's quite clear. If you observe 2 black swans, then of course you're not allowed to say all swans are white, right? So you must observe, say, with the example of swans, you must a large number of swans you must observe, and then you must make these observations under very different conditions, which means, for instance, don't just go to the zoo in Hanover, right? But you go to other countries where also swans are, and then that's of course the condition that brings you to finding out that there are black swans, because condition is, for instance, go also to other continents, and then you find, wow, in Australia they have black swans. Okay, so I have to be careful with my generalization. All right, and then of course, if you are only allowed to generalize if none of the observation statements is in contradiction with your general statement, right? And the position of inductivism says these are in step 2, after the careful observation of the singular cases, these are the conditions that allow you to generalize. If you have, as I said, a large number of observation under very different conditions, and finally that none of the observation statements contradicts the general hypothesis. All right. Now, let's see, what's the next here? Okay, let's make a short break here. Do you understand the logic of all that? What you not know yet is why we so necessarily need general statements. That's the next step. But what I did so far is I made the difference, I made the distinction between the singular statements and the general statements. I told you that finding out whether singular statements are true is comparatively easy if we have observable facts, right? But then going from the singular statements to the general statements is tricky, because the general statement speaks about indefinitely many facts, and you have not observed indefinitely many. So there is a problem in between, and inductivism tells you how to solve this problem. It says, yes, under certain conditions are you allowed to go from the singular statements to the general statements, and these are the 3 conditions. You must have a large number of observations. You must vary the conditions of the observations. And then every singular observation must be in agreement with the general statement. And if that is the case, then inductivism tells you, yes, then you are allowed to make a general statement, right? And that sounds extremely plausible. I mean, how else? I mean, what else could you imagine? A general statement is about many things. You can't observe all of them, because you also usually speak about the future. If you say all swans are white, you speak about also, of course, the swans that will live in 100 years from now. Or if you speak about a plant, if it's still the same species, I mean, if you don't tinker around with it. So we have an indefinite number, an open set of possibilities. We cannot observe all of them. And therefore, we have to be very careful in generalizing from the singular to the general. And inductivism tells you, yes, this is tricky. It is not absolutely foolproof, but here are the basic rules, the 3 conditions. If you follow these 3 conditions, then you are on a very good track. And then to articulate a general statement, and you can say, yes, for this general statement, I've got a good justification, and that's the fulfillment of the 3 conditions, right? Large number of observations and so on. That's the idea. Is that plausible to you? Okay. Yes, moderate agreement. All right, any questions concerning that? Anything which is completely unclear? Or do I talk too fast? Well, you can then, in the video, you can record it, you can look at it again. Okay, is that somehow, any questions? No questions? No shyness? No? All right, let's see. All right. Now, what is still open at the moment is why, or yes, still open at the moment, why in science and engineering one is interested in general statements. Why is it not enough to be on the safe side, right? I mean, you may say, okay, I'm a water engineer. I always go to particular lakes, and I look at the particular lake and I want to have a statement then about its state. Well, you'll see, if you want to do more than just making a diagnosis of that particular lake, then you want to have general statements. I'll show you why. Well, the general statements that you need in science and engineering, that is why they are indispensable. It's just absolutely indispensable. You have to have them. You need general statements, theories, models, hypotheses, and whatnot, all this general stuff, yeah, that comes under different names. They are needed for scientific explanations, they are needed for scientific predictions, and they are needed for technical applications. So everything you really want to do in science and in engineering is explanations, predictions, and technical applications. That's all you want to have, right? Either you want to explain something, you have a certain phenomenon, you want to understand what's going on here, and you say, look, I want to have a scientific explanation of that. I don't know what's happening. Why is this plant susceptible to this and that influence, and that other plant is not, and so on and so forth. So you want to have explanations. You want to have predictions, right? You want to predict certain things. When you do something, you want to predict what's going to happen. And of course, you want to have technical applications. So you want to say you have a river or a lake, and that's contaminated, and then you say, okay, we propose the following measures in order to decrease the contamination and to get the fishes back and whatnot, right? So you want to have technical applications. I'll talk about these three things in more detail, but that is the basic aims of what you are doing in your studies. I mean, both in engineering and in science, this is all about explanations, predictions, and technical applications. This is what to do. If you are a historian, then it's different. If you do economic history, for instance, it's also explanations, but it's less predictions and less technical applications, and the explanations are somewhat different in the historical fields. But in the scientific fields, in natural science, and also in engineering, these are the main things, right? Technical control, technical applications. That is probably why most of you here came to Europe, because you are interested in doing something with plants, you know, in increasing some output or whatever it is, or finding better varieties that are in your climate conditions are better adapted, and so on and so forth. That is probably, I guess, why you are here, why you say, I came to Germany in order to study international horticulture science or study water resources and environment management, because you want to do something, right? And these are all technical applications then of scientific knowledge and engineering knowledge. That is what you do. Therefore, that's extremely important, and this is why we need general statements. I give you the argument why you need for these things general statements. They're absolutely indispensable if you want to do that. So, if you say, okay, this problem of induction of the general statements, that's a problem that's too hard, I don't want to touch it, then you're giving all that up. No explanations, no predictions, no technical applications. So what's the sense of science then? If you don't get that, right? Nothing. Then you can say about a particular plant, well, you're very nice and have 9 leaves. Wonderful. But nothing more, right? And the point is, as long as you want to have explanations, predictions, and technical applications, you need the general statements. I'm going to show you why that's the case. I'm just telling you the importance of that. Therefore, it's absolutely impossible in science to give up general statements because they say, oh, that problem is unsolvable, or it's so difficult, or so on. No, we must deal with that problem, otherwise we don't get these goods, and these are the goods why we do science, right? Therefore, we absolutely need that. And in order now to argue that, I must tell you something about what explanations are in science, what predictions are in science, and what technical applications in science and engineering are, and tell you something about them, and then you see that you really need the general statements in order to deliver these goods that science is supposed to deliver, right? Now let us start with explanations and predictions. Probably have to break them somewhere in the middle, but let's continue a little at least. Explanations and predictions. Now, the point is here, and this is a somewhat simplified picture that I'm giving you, but the main aim is that you get the basic idea. So it's a little simplified, but it's okay to take home. Both activities of explaining something and predicting something in the sciences follow the same pattern. And the pattern is this. Here is a particular event, S0 of type S, a description of a situation. That's S is from the situation, right? That's the one. Here's a particular event. Then you have a general statement. Whenever an event of type S, then an event of type K will follow. That's a general hypothesis. Whenever an event of type S, then an event of type K. It's very abstract. Just wait a little, you'll understand it in a second. And therefore you can say, when I have S0 here, then I get K0 here, the conclusion. That's because the general statement tells you whenever you have an event of type S, and S0 is a event of type S, then you get an event of type K, and that particular event you get is then called K0, right? That's a logical conclusion, right? And the idea is that explanations and predictions follow this logical pattern, okay? That's the idea. This abstract pattern, this is very abstract, right? I know it. And you say, oh, it's very abstract, I don't understand what's going on. That's the pattern that how explanations in science and predictions are made. That's how they're made. I'll give you an example, okay, or two examples even. Now, for example, predict how far a mass falls on the surface of the Earth within 1 second. Right? That's a prediction. I have this mass here, and, well, I use something less imagine, okay? I let loose, and then someone asks, you're a physicist, can't you predict how far that will fall within 1 second? Well, in 1 second here, in that case, of course, it hits the ground before 1 second, but let's imagine we are on the 4th floor, right, at the window. And then someone says, you're a physicist, can't you predict how far that thing will fall within 1 second? And then the answer is, yes, I can predict that. How can I do that? Well, I'm not asking you now, any one of you, to go to the blackboard and predict that, but I simply show you. Now, what you need is the law of free fall, right? That's the Galileo's law of free fall on the Earth. And that law of free fall tells the following: d is the distance, and d is 1/2 times g. G is the acceleration constant on the Earth, times t squared. T is the time. G is 9.8. Omit the thing. Is that familiar to anyone or never heard of it? Complete Chinese to you? Turkish? No? Never heard of it? Well, that's the law of free fall. Okay, d is the distance. Do I say that d is the distance? No. Oh, I'm sorry. It should, of course, I should explain that. I thought you were familiar with it. Anyway, d is the distance, you want to know what's the distance, all right? T is time. Do you use the term, the letter T for time? Good. Wonderful. Okay. That's the gravitation, that's the low acceleration of the Earth, and that is 9.8 meters per square second. Doesn't matter. And the situation is this: the situation in which you want to predict something is this, that you say, I want to know what happens after 1 second, right? And now what you do is you have to calculate. That's very difficult to calculate. Huh? You have to put in all what you know in this equation here. And t is 1, t square. 1 square is 1. Okay, that's easy. 9.8 comes in here. 1 times 9.8 and then 1/2. 9.8 divided by 2 is 4.9. And here we are. So the law of the free fall tells you that after 1 second, a mass that was let loose and felt falls 4.9 meters. That's a prediction that you can make in physics, right? And this is elementary physics. And what you see is the prediction. The conclusion, therefore, D follows deductively or by logical deduction from the premises, right? And the premises are, you tell the physicist who has to predict that the situation is this. I wait for 1 second and let something fall, and wait for 1 second, and then the physicist says, I can predict what happens by using the law of free fall. And the use of the law of free fall is such that you deduce, that's the term, you follow logically or mathematically, it follows from that law. If you tell the law that you wait for 1 second, then the law tells you and predicts you that the distance will be 4.9 meters, right? That you can do because you have the law. If you have no law, no prediction. No way, right? In order to predict, you have to have the law. And therefore, for any sort of prediction in the natural sciences, any sort of prediction is based on these laws in this case. You can also predict from theories, you can predict from models, you can predict from general correlations and whatnot. It's all has some sort of problems, but that's not the point. The point here is that I want to show you that if you want to predict in the sciences, then you need the general statements, because the general statements do the job for the prediction. The general statements doesn't tell you anything immediately about a special case, but you have to tell the law what the special case is that you want to observe. So you have to tell the law what the situation is in which you want to apply it. You know, let's go back here. That's the point. Here's a particular event of S0 of type S, namely an event of free fall, right, in a situation in which you wait for 1 second. Then you have the general statement, that's then the law of free fall, and then you can deduce from the general statement, given this information, the conclusion, and the conclusion in this particular case is that the distance traversed within 1 second will be 4.9 meters. So I will stop here, but let's conclude that you see in this particular example, and that particular example is quite representative for many, many cases, that if you want to predict something in the sciences, and of course you want to do that very often, and also in engineering you want to predict something, then what you need is a general connection, or something very general. And then what you do is you say, the particular situation I'm looking at is a particular case of that general statement. And the general statement then allows you to make the prediction you are interested in. So that's one of the reasons why you absolutely need, in the natural sciences and in engineering, general statements, because otherwise you couldn't make predictions. A prediction is something which you have not observed yet, right? So it's just a new case. How can you say anything about a new case? Well, only if you can subsume it under a general connection, right? A general statement. And that is why we need the general statements, and I'll show you next time then that the same holds for explanations, that also for explanations in science and engineering you need these general statements, and also for the technical applications you need the general statements. So it's absolutely unavoidable to deal in science with the general statements, and the problem that arises, that was the beginning of my presentation about inductivism, is that it's not so easy to find out whether a given general statement is a solid one you should believe in, because you cannot observe them, as you can in the case of singular statements of observable fact. Okay, so let's go to the next step, and the next step is now that's just a conclusion here. By means of this pattern, a K0 that has not yet happened can be predicted if S0 and the general hypothesis are known. So the main thing is, if you want to predict something in a particular situation, you need a general statement which covers that sort of situation, and then you describe what the situation is. For instance, you are interested in the fall, the distance that a mass traverses within 1 second. That's what you want to know, and then you can apply the general law. So we need general laws for predictions, otherwise predictions aren't possible. And exactly the same pattern, roughly speaking, applies if you want to explain something. Imagine that you don't want to predict the free fall of a certain object, but a certain object has fallen a certain distance, and you want to explain it. You want to say, why did it fall within 1 second, just 4.9 meters? Why is that so? Then the explanation has to take into account a law, and the law then tells you, look, the general relationship between time and distance for the case of free fall is this and that, namely the law of free fall. And that law then explains to you why the distance is just 4.9 meters, right? If you look at, and also in your own fields of study, if you look where explanations are given, the explanations always have to recur to a general statement. It may be a model, it may be a theory, it may be a law. I told you the different possibilities of general statements in the sciences. And these laws or theories or generalizations, whatever it is, they form the basis for the explanations. They give you the power to explain something. If you have something completely unknown and an unknown phenomenon in the natural sciences and you say, I don't understand what's going on, please explain it to me, then you have always take recourse to some general statement, a theory, a law, a model, or whatever. So this is this pattern for prediction is also valid as a pattern for explanation. And you see that you absolutely need for these explanations and predictions the general statements, and therefore we cannot say, okay, general statements are problematic, let's forget about them in science. It's just impossible because we need them in order to do what we want to do in science, namely prediction and explanation. Okay? Now, the same holds, and this is now the part, so to speak, especially for the engineers, but also for the people in horticulture science, because you also have technical applications in many, many, many cases. What you do, so this is the same there for both courses. And I say first something very general about technical action. Technical action is doing one thing in order to realize another thing. That's a very general and abstract. It's not extremely helpful, right? But that is really the essence of technical action. You do one thing in order to realize another thing. And now let's look at that a little closer. And a concrete example will follow soon. Let's assume you want to generate an event of type K, or a process of type K, or a thing of type K. You want to generate that. You want to make that happen. Then you have a general statement. Let's assume we have a general statement of this form. This is now abstract. The example will follow. We have a general statement. Whenever an event of type S, then an event of type K. This is a general hypothesis, which connects, two events of different types, type S and type K. And let's assume we have a general statement that tells you whenever an event of type S, then you get an event of type K. That's the general hypothesis. And then if you have that general hypothesis, or general theory, or whatever it is, then you have a possibility for technical action, namely in the following sense. You realize a particular S, say S0, and you will get K0, right? This is technical action. You do one thing, namely S0, and you get K0, you get another thing. And that's exactly technical action, doing one thing in order to get something else, right? A technical action is always, as I said, doing one thing in order to get something else. If I switch on or switch off this machine here, what I really do is press a button here, right? This is what I really do, and I get something else. I get something up here, right? And that's wherever you have technical action, it's always the same. You do one thing in order to get something else, right? This is technical action. And I give you an example here. And this is an example now for the water engineers. I hope the example is right. I looked in the internet a little on lakes and stuff like that. Let us assume you want to regulate the level L of a lake. Is that an application that's from your real life, to regulate the level of a lake? Is that for the water engineers? That is a problem, right? It may be a natural lake, it may be a lake connected to a power system, whatever it is. You want to regulate the level of a lake, right? You cannot just go there and regulate the level, and go to the level and regulate it. You can't do that. There is no handle on the level, right? You must do something else. So what you need a general relation among L and the relevant variables, right? The relevant variables concerning the level of a lake is the outflow, the inflow, the evaporation, and other things. Right? I think inflow, outflow, and evaporation, and of course precipitation are the relevant variables that influence the level of your lake. Right? Is that correct? Also, yes. So you can call that this general relation. This is a model of the lake. Right? If you have an equation that connects the level of your lake together with the relevant inflow that you have, the evaporation, and so on, all the relevant variables, you can say, I have a level of the lake here. If you put in then the right constants, right? The right parameters, then you have a level of that particular lake. And now it's very clear that you can, for instance, manipulate the outflow such that the desired level of the lake results. Right? You have the other variables constant, the inflow, the evaporation, whatever it is, or they vary according to a certain pattern, and then you regulate the level of your lake by manipulating the outflow. Right? If the level is too low, you stop the outflow. If the level is too high, you open the outflow, roughly speaking. And that's exactly technical action. You do one thing, You go to the outflow, you open it or close it, right? And then what results is the level of the lake, right? The change of the level of the lake. And in order to do that, of course, you need the connection, right? The relationship between the outflow, which you can manipulate, and the level of your lake. And that is a general relation that you need. So you have to have general relations if you want to technically manipulate certain things, meaning technical action, meaning doing one thing in order to achieve another thing, right? And we need technical action because many things cannot be directly manipulated. So if I say I want to pick up this watch here, that's no problem. That's not a technical action. I just do it, I just lift it. But when I say I want to switch on this machine over there, well, that's a little more complicated. I don't really know how to switch it on, to connect it there. I mean, I open it or whatever and connect. I don't know exactly how to do that. Well, I could learn it perhaps. It takes me I don't know how long. But it's very simple. If I have this little thing here, then I press a button. Well, not this one, in fact. This one. I don't want to lie to you, You want to have the truth here. Okay. But then I can press that button here, and then this machine reacts, and this is technical action, doing one thing in order to do something else. But for that, of course, I need the general relationship between this little machine and that one. Namely, there is a regularity that if everything functions, this technical thing functions, then I know here's a power bottom. If I press the power bottom, the power will go on here, right? And I have to have this general relation, right? It's not enough that someone did it once and says, oh, I did it in this way. I have to generalize and say, okay, perhaps that works to every such machine. So if I press this button, then this machine will go on or will go off. So I need the general relation, and that is why, also for technical applications, we need general correlations, general statements that correlate things of one sort or variables of one sort with variables of another sort. So this is the story why, both in the natural sciences and in the engineering science, and then also, of course, for engineering practitioners, technicians, they all need general statements, because otherwise there is no technical application possible for anything, no technical action. So we need them. So it's an important question to ask, and inductivism and the other positions also ask this question: how is it possible to get these general statements that we need for explanations, predictions, and technical actions? And the answer of inductivism is very clear. Yes, you can get these general statements if you carefully generalize from the singular statements and carefully generalizing, meaning the fulfillment of the three conditions C1, C2, and C3. Okay? All right, so let's summarize that. We can now say what the position of inductivism tells us about science. According to inductivism, scientific research consists of an inductive procedure, right? Inductive procedure, the step of generalization, by which scientific hypotheses are gained, right? This is the step from the singular statements to the general statements, and logical deductions from these hypotheses. Right, this I explained to you, by which predictions, explanations, and the possibility of technical applications are given. If you compare that, if you have a printout, the possibility of technical applications is now new in here, and you haven't printed it out. I just added it 5 minutes ago. Right? You see, this is a lecture that is alive. It's not dead. Okay? So I added it. Okay, it wasn't in here. And the possibility of technical actions. All right? Okay, this is the essence here of inductivism. And then we get an answer to the question from which we started. We started from the question, what is science, right? What is special about science? Why is scientific knowledge better, presumably, than other forms of knowledge? And inductivism gets us a very clear answer to that question. It tells us scientific is different from and more reliable than other forms of knowledge. Why? Because the two steps that generated the general knowledge are much more rigorously controlled than the steps that lead to other forms of knowledge. Right? Everyone has, in order to get general statements, has to generalize. There's no way around that. But the point is that inductivism says, you know, scientific knowledge is better than other forms of knowledge because we control the crucial step, the critical step, namely the step from the singular statements to the general statements. We control that step much, much better. You know, we know exactly what we're doing, we reflect upon it, and I guess that in many of the work, in much of the work you are doing for your master's thesis, it's exactly that sort of step where you say we have to be very careful when we go from singular statements to general statements. You have to use statistics. You have to ask the question, how many specific specimens do I need if I want to have a certain statement? Do I need 5? Do I need 15? Or do I need 400 or 4,000? Is that feasible with the equipment that I have? And so on and so forth. And that's the sort of tedious work in detail that characterizes science. That is what inductivism says. And therefore, the result of these more tedious, detailed procedures is that the resulting knowledge is much more reliable. So we get a very plausible, I think, and very convincing answer by inductivism. What is special about scientific knowledge, right? It analyzes the steps by which scientific knowledge is gained. It says, here are the critical steps, and here's the answer how to deal with that critical step, namely by articulating these 3 conditions, C1 to C3, and saying these have to be obeyed. You know, they have to be taken very seriously when it comes to the generation of scientific knowledge. All right. Is that position plausible? Right? Isn't that a plausible answer to the question what science is? Right? This was the idea. Okay? Now here's an historical remark first before we proceed further. From about the beginning of modern science in the 17th century, you may know the rough picture, modern science, the modern form of science began in the beginning around 17th century. Of course, there isn't a particular day at which people said, bang, from here on we have modern science. But that was, of course, a process of a transition. But when we look back from today, then it is safe to say that something happened around the beginning of the 17th century. It started, of course, earlier, and it was not on the 1st of January of 1600, but it was a certain period here of 50 or 70 years in which something happened. And then when it comes to the time of Newton in the later 17th century, then we have a full-blown new form of knowledge, of scientific knowledge, a new form of scientific procedure, which is the procedure of modern physics in comparison to the older forms of physics. I don't want to go into the detail. The point is that the idea in the 17th century, and that lasted into the 20th century, that inductivism is the right description of what the essence of modern science is. That was a very, very well-established idea, and it was so widespread that the natural sciences were even called inductive sciences. Right? This was the characterization. People said, yes, they are the sciences that make use of the inductive generalization in order to come to the general statements, the natural laws, the general theories, and whatnot. Right? This is the general tree, the general theory. Have you ever heard the term inductive sciences back home in any of your studies? No, doesn't matter. It's a name, right? And now you understand the name. They're inductive sciences because they use induction. Deductive sciences is mathematics, right? Mathematics is deductive. It's not inductive at all. It's only deductions. And that's the difference. So the deductive science is mathematics, and the inductive sciences are the natural sciences. And, of course, adding in the 20th century, the engineering sciences. Okay. Okay. Now, I must insert an intermediate step that seems to be not connected to what I said before, but we have to get some clarity about a certain aspect here of the question we are dealing with, because we need that sooner or later, and I insert it here because then we can also reflect back on what we did when I developed this position of inductivism. It's called the normative versus descriptive philosophy of science. That doesn't tell you anything, all right, I guess, so I'm going to explain it to you. And I start with the observation that there seem to be two principal ways of answering the question posed in section 1, what is science, right? When you say, okay, I want to find out what science is, then there seem to be two rather different routes to an answer to this question. And the first one would be, if you are a scientist, that would probably the thing that comes to your mind first, that you say, okay, if I want to know what science is, I better observe the scientists at work, right? They are the practitioners of science, so let us observe them, and then let's find out what they do, and once we've found that out, we can describe what they do, and that is science, right? An empirical procedure. That's how all of you proceed in your particular field, right? If you want to study levels of lakes or whatever, or contamination of lakes, or behaviors of plants, or of greenhouses, or whatnot, what you say, okay, I must go into the field, or to the lakes, or to the plants, or grow the plants in the lab, or whatever, and then I have to observe what these things are doing, right? And then I have to be intelligent and make the right observations, and then sooner or later I can answer my question about them. This is an empirical procedure. You make an empirical investigation into the peculiarities of your subject, in this case of science, and you observe what scientists really do. That is a scientific procedure that is, so to speak, standard. If you want to know something about an object, then you have to go observe the object under varying conditions, blah, blah, and then you look at it, and then in the end you get an answer. So it would be, of course, quite plausible and convincing, I guess, that if you ask the question, what is science? Well, then we have to observe science. How to observe science? Well, by looking what the scientists do. And when we observe what scientists do, then we can come at the end, possibly, to a conclusion what science is. This is one procedure, right? Now there is an alternative. That is, of course, for most scientists, this is at first sight completely implausible that there could be an alternative to that, because that is how science proceeds. So how could there be an alternative? Well, there is an alternative. Well, first of all, this would be a descriptive procedure. Roughly speaking, you are describing what happens in science. And then you try to find a sort of description of what science is, and then you can answer the question. This is science, and you describe it, right? This is one way of doing it, and this is probably the most plausible one for scientists. Now, there is another procedure, and this sounds possibly a little fantastic at first sight, but I tell you why it's not really fantastic. One may consider how science should proceed in order to produce reliable knowledge. Right? You're approaching the subject differently. You're not saying, I'm just observing what people do, but you say, let me think. Right? The aim of science is to produce reliable knowledge. Now, what should people do if they want to produce reliable knowledge? Right? It's a different angle. You say, let us think about it, what they should do, what could they do if they want to produce reliable knowledge. Then you're not observing people, but you say, what should they do in order to produce reliable knowledge? And this would be so-called normative procedure. You're not describing something, but you're giving a norm. A norm is a sort of general imperative, right? You tell people what to do. And you think, okay, what do I want to have? Oh, I want to have reliable knowledge. Reliable knowledge, say, of general statements. So what should people do in order to gain reliable knowledge? And perhaps you can get an answer to that. Perhaps it's possible to answer this question, what people should do. And let me have a look. And that is, in fact, what I did when I introduced inductivism. I never told you that I observed people here on the second floor in their laboratories or anywhere. I didn't say anything about that. What I did is I started with, well, you see, in science there are general statements and there are singular statements. We have no problem with the singular statements, at least no big problem, but we do have a problem with the general statements, right? I did not tell you, look, this scientist told me that. No, it's quite plausible. And then in developing the inductive procedure, with the three conditions, I did not give you particular examples from the science and said, no, I observed it yesterday up there, you know, second floor. Scientist X did it that way. But it is just a very plausible thing when you think about it, how to get from singular statements to general statements. You just think about it and say, yes, of course one should do this and that. One should do this and that. So the result we are getting, namely here, inductivism, is not the result by observation, but we followed a normative procedure by thinking about it, what the problems are, right? And made it plausible. We didn't need big observations. But if you think about it, well, how can I get from singular statements to general statements? Wow, that's difficult, right? I could make mistakes. How could I avoid the mistakes? Oh yes, and then the three conditions. And if you read the three conditions, of course you must have a large number of observations. I don't know, I don't have to go to a lab. I mean, if you think about it, of course, the larger the basis of particular observations, the better, of course, the possibilities is to generalize. That's obvious, right, if you think about it. And also the variation of conditions, and also the non-contradiction to the general statement. That's quite plausible, right? You can think about it that, yes, it should be that way. So we followed a normative procedure in my presentation of inductivism. Such a philosophy of science that results from these normative procedures is called a normative philosophy of science. I'm telling you that here because later we'll get descriptive philosophies of science and the conflict between them, and that's very important, and therefore you have to be clear what one is doing. Okay, so the philosophy of science, the inductivism, is a normative philosophy of science, meaning it did not result from an empirical investigation of what scientists do, but resulted from thinking what rules should be followed if the knowledge that is produced should be reliable knowledge. That was the procedure, right? By thinking about it. And this is to some degree possible, apparently, as I showed you with inductivism. All right. So all you have to remember is that in these areas of philosophy, where we ask questions like what is science, there is mostly, not always, but mostly, at least two possibilities, a more empirical procedure and a more normative procedure. Think about a different area for a moment. Think about ethics, right? Think about what are we allowed to do, say, to animals, right? Say, are we allowed to eat animals? Are we allowed to use animals in laboratory experiments? Are we allowed to use chimpanzees in brain research? And, in brain research, meaning we do rather cruel experiments in the result, and the chimpanzees die afterwards, right? Are we allowed to use 100,000, 10,000 chimpanzees in order to do brain research? Right? This is a relevant question. It's a very, very relevant question. How can you approach this question? You cannot approach it empirically. If you approach it empirically, what you can say, yes, in this lab they use 100 chimpanzees a year, in that lab they use 150, in this lab they don't use any chimpanzees, and in this lab but you don't get an answer to what you should do, right? Whether it's ethically allowed, whether it's okay to use chimpanzees for research. You don't get an answer to the moral question empirically. It's absolutely impossible to get empirically an answer to normative questions. It's just impossible, right? So there are questions, and of course this is a very relevant question. I mean, it's a relevant question, and this is only a very concerning animals. You have the same, of course, in medicine. I mean, what are the procedures that are allowed in medicine? In all sorts of experimentation. If you develop a new pharmaceutical, and what sort of tests are allowed, what are too dangerous. You have in assisted suicide, and in many, many, many ethical questions. You've always in the same situation. An empirical investigation doesn't help you, because an empirical investigation never produces the sort of knowledge you want to have, namely the knowledge of what you should do. Right? And the knowledge of what you should do can never be empirically gained. Empirical knowledge may play a role, but it cannot be empirically gained. And therefore, in this case, if we ask how science should be in order to produce reliable knowledge, we are in an area where these normative questions play a role, and a philosophy of science that deals with that normative question and tries to answer it cannot be exclusively based on empirical investigations, but it must be somehow based on normative investigations. For a scientist, usually people say, well, that's impossible. Well, it is not empirical, but somehow, in the case of inductivism, it was somehow successful, because I think the idea is now very plausible that science is as inductivism describes, and this is rightly so, because that procedure that inductivism describes is a procedure that leads to more reliable knowledge than other procedures, right? And therefore it's a good procedure, so you can evaluate it. All right. So at the moment, this is only an insertion that makes a little thing now, or makes you aware of what we did, that we followed a normative procedure, and even if you are now suspicious and saying, wow, normative procedures, that's very strange. Yes, it is very strange. But look at it, look back at it and say, yes, it is plausible, right? And it is a normative procedure, right? And it is plausible, and somehow it seems to work. Okay, we will need that later, because later I'll come to positions where people say, look, this normative procedure of inductivism is really very bad for this and that reason. But in order to understand the argument, one has to first be aware of the fact that indeed we did follow a normative procedure in this particular case. Okay. Now this ends, at the moment, the direct presentation of inductivism.